They had marched together under one name. They had crossed deserts, broken empires, and stood side by side as the world fell before them. Under Alexander the Great, they were not rivals, they were brothers in conquest. They trusted each other with their lives. On the battlefield, hesitation meant death. And yet, again and again, they fought as one, disciplined, unstoppable, united by a leader no one could replace. But that unity was fragile, because it depended on one man. And the moment he died, everything changed. There was no clear successor, no single voice strong enough to command the same loyalty. Only powerful men, each with armies, ambition, and their own vision of what the empire should become. At first, they tried to hold it together. They spoke of unity, of stability, of preserving what they had built. But beneath the surface, something else was growing. Suspicion, fear, calculation. Because every one of them understood the truth they would not say out loud. The empire no longer had a master, and without a master, there could only be one outcome. The men who conquered the world together were about to go to war with each other. After the death of Alexander the Great in Babylon, the empire did not immediately collapse. Instead, it paused. The generals gathered, not as enemies, but as survivors of a system that had suddenly lost its center. They needed order. They needed legitimacy. Without it, everything they had built would dissolve into chaos. So they made an agreement. Alexander's half-brother, Philip III, would be king. The unborn child, Alexander IV, would share the throne. And ruling in their name would be one man, Perdiccas. On the surface, it worked. The empire still had kings. It still had a structure. Commands were still given. Armies still obeyed. But it was not real power. It was a compromise, a fragile illusion designed to delay the inevitable. Because the generals were not equals. Each one controlled regions, troops, and resources. Each one had earned loyalty through years of war. And none of them were willing to surrender that power completely to another man, especially not to Perdiccas. To some, he was the natural choice, trusted by Alexander, placed at the center of command. But to others, he was something more dangerous, a man who might try to become king in everything but name. So they smiled. They agreed. They pretended, but behind every agreement was doubt. Behind every order was resistance. They had avoided war, but only for the moment. The illusion did not last, because one man chose to act before the balance could settle. Ptolemy I Soter understood something the others were still pretending to ignore. Power was no longer about loyalty to the empire. It was about control. So he moved. Egypt became his base. Rich, defensible, distant from the center where Perdiccas held authority. But securing territory was not enough. He needed legitimacy. And in the ancient world, legitimacy could be taken. When Alexander's body was being transported for burial, it was more than a funeral procession. It was a symbol of authority, of continuity, of who truly carried the legacy of the king. Ptolemy intercepted it. He diverted the procession and brought Alexander's body to Egypt. It was not an act of respect. It was a declaration, a message sent across the empire without words. I decide what happens now. Because whoever held Alexander's body held a piece of his power, and by taking it, Ptolemy did something no general had openly done before. He defied the center. He challenged Perdiccas directly. From that moment, the unity of the empire was no longer even an illusion. It was broken. No meeting could fix it. No agreement could restore it. Because now, the question was no longer theoretical. It was real, and it demanded an answer. Who controls the empire? Perdiccas could not ignore what had happened. As regent, his authority depended on one thing above all else: the belief that he could enforce order. If Ptolemy's action went unanswered, that belief would collapse, and with it, any claim to central control. So he chose to act, not as a negotiator, but as a commander. To him, this was not personal ambition. It was necessity. The empire could not survive if every general acted independently. It needed structure. It needed obedience. It needed a center, and he intended to be that center. So he prepared for war. His target was clear: Egypt. If he could defeat Ptolemy I Soter, recover Alexander's body, and reassert authority, the message would be undeniable. The empire still had one master, but not everyone saw it that way. Other generals began to watch carefully. Some quietly supported Ptolemy. Others feared what Perdiccas might become if he succeeded. Alliances began to shift, not openly, not yet, but beneath the surface, because this was no longer about unity. It was about survival. Every decision carried risk. Every move could reshape the balance of power. And as Perdiccas marched south, leading the imperial army toward Egypt, he believed he was restoring order. But in reality, he was crossing a line that could not be undone. The regent was no longer preserving peace. He was marching to war. The campaign did not unfold as Perdiccas expected. Egypt was not just another province. It was protected by geography, by distance, and now by a general who understood exactly what was at stake. Ptolemy I Soter did not rush into open battle. He waited, he defended, he let the environment do the work. And when Perdiccas reached the Nile, the situation changed completely. The river was not just an obstacle. It was a barrier that turned strategy into risk. Crossing it required coordination, discipline, and trust. And that trust was already weakening. Attempts to cross failed. Soldiers drowned. Formations broke under pressure. Confusion spread. What should have been a decisive campaign became a slow, visible collapse of confidence. Inside the army, doubt grew. Officers began to question leadership, not out loud at first, but in whispers, in hesitation, in the way orders were followed or not followed. Because this was no longer a war against an external enemy. This was a war against their own, and many of them were no longer sure it was worth fighting. Then came the breaking point. In the middle of the campaign, inside his own camp, Perdiccas lost control. His officers turned on him. Among them was Seleucus I Nicator, the man who had marched under Alexander, the man who had followed the chain of command, now choosing survival over loyalty. Perdiccas was assassinated, not in battle, not by the enemy, but by his own commanders. The first war of the empire had reached its conclusion, and it had destroyed the man who tried to hold it together. With the death of Perdiccas, something fundamental changed. Before, there had still been a possibility, however fragile, that the empire could remain united under a central authority. Now, that possibility was gone. No one could claim uncontested power. No one could enforce unity. The illusion had finally collapsed. The generals were no longer pretending. They were no longer acting in the name of a shared empire. They were acting for themselves. Each region became a base of power. Each army became a personal force. Alliances formed and broke as quickly as they were made. What had begun as tension had become open conflict. This was no longer a crisis. It was a transformation. The beginning of the Wars of the Diadochi, a series of wars that would last for decades and permanently divide Alexander's empire into rival kingdoms. Egypt would rise under Ptolemy. The East would eventually fall under Seleucus, and the dream of a single, unified empire would disappear, not because it was defeated from outside, but because it destroyed itself from within. And this was only the beginning. In the next episode, the alliances break completely, and the war for Alexander's empire enters its most dangerous phase. Subscribe and continue the campaign.